Hello all, welcome to this presentation on a poem titled Indian Site on the Edge of Tonita Pasture. This is a poem prescribed for the S5 English students of the University of Kerala. This comes under the paper Post-Colonial Literatures in English. So the title of the poem is quite interesting. It's called Indian Site on the Edge of Tonita Pasture. And my presentation is titled A Reading of the Same. Now, this is how we'll be going about the presentation. We will have a brief introduction to the poet, Andrew Suknaski. And then we will have a reading of the poem, followed by an analysis of the poem, and finally, the conclusion. Now, Andrew Suknaski, a very interesting poet from Wood Mountain. Now, he was born on 30th July 1942, and he passed on 3rd May 2012. Now, he's a poet from Wood Mountain, Saskatchewan, which is a province in Canada. Now, he has an interesting ancestry. His father was Ukrainian and his mother was Polish, so English was not his first language. He started learning English only after he started school. So here we have a writer of mixed ancestry who has not learned English, writing in English about this varied landscape of Canada. So he's a major voice as far as Western Canadian writing is concerned. And what is interesting about Suknaski is that he is a poet who writes his town into existence. He is a poet of place. In his poems, what we find is a representation of the ancestral space. Now, the ancestral space can be described as a spiritual space, a spirit represented by the original inhabitants, not only of the native Indians, but the land itself, its animals and its plants, its wind and stones. So he is a poet who grapples with questions of home and identity. In this particular poem, he talks about two different kinds of pasts, a settler past and also the native Indian past. So you have him talking about different kinds of pasts in this poem. Now, Suknaski is known as a writer of the Canadian prairies. Now, the prairies are a unique feature of Canada, and they are there are a lot of tales and narratives associated with the prairies, which prairies are part of the Canadian mindscape and landscape. Now, some of the major poems by Suknaski include the Wood Mountain poems, which was published in 1976, and the poem that we have to study is also a part of that collection. Then we have the collection called The Ghosts Call You Poor, which came out in 1978, and another collection, In the Name of the Narod, which came out in 1981. Now, the poem, Indian Site on the Edge of Tonita Pasture, it is very significant as far as the title goes by. It is a title of a place, is it not? We are going to discuss about an Indian site which is at the edge, which is located at the edge of a pasture which belongs to the Tonita family. So that is exactly what the title means. So you have again, in the title itself, you have the two pasts of Saskatchewan, or Wood Mountain to be precise. It has the Indian heritage, and it also talks about the settler heritage in the form of the Tonita pasture. So we have two different pasts coming together in the title itself. That is why it is significant. Now let's move on to a reading of the poem. And so let's read the poem once, and then we will start the analysis. The meadow lark's song, heralding spring waters, lazily flowing from Wood Mountain's peat moss springs to become 12-mile creek running north through the schoolie where I caught fish and swam in boyhood, unaware of 3 rings of stones that nearly vanished beneath dust from a field. Lee Sopalo's father worked trying to feed his family in the 30s. And this great center ring and something holding me around my heart the way a wired stone anchors the corner post of the nearby fence, running north and west to the village where I grew up. I claim these things and this ancestral space to move through and beyond, stapled to the 4 cardinal directions. This, my right to chronicle the meaning of these vast plains in a geography of blood and failure, making them live. Vasil Tonita, 70 now, and once again riding the spirited stallion his sons have never ridden, counts his spring calves and searches for a missing cow south in the coulee, where a hawk slowly circles under the high sun, where I stand here listening for the possible ancestral voices as the wind passes, rustling the rose bushes and taller grasses by the creek. And I try to imagine those who passed here so long ago, possibly becoming this dust I breathe. Try to imagine how prairie could once become a brown sea, following a sound greater than thunder, a sea shaking the earth beneath an Indian's feet, and how his daily breath became a prayer, shaping all thought toward food for a family. But that time has passed. The marks of those who saw it, few and seldom found, except by the rare eye, spotting a stone here and a stone there, following a hunch and using imagination and the good sense of one's feet till the circle is completed, as Lee Sopalo did one spring, placing a wired anchor stone beneath the corner post, then straightened his back with pain, his eyes suddenly blurring, and then focusing on the first stone he walked toward, studying the place, till all three circles where the teepees once stood were discovered. And who were the ancestors that camped here? Only the wind knows for certain. Though maybe they were the Grosventre, the Ashkey, some of whom died from hunger, along with Assiniboine middlemen journeying down from York factory that summer of 1716 when the English ships carrying provisions did not arrive early enough. Or maybe they were some of the Assiniboine met here by their brothers who traded on the Missouri, contracting smallpox for the second time at Fort Union in 1837. Doing the same as others before them, fleeing northward, believing they could thus escape the dreaded disease the white men gave them. But the Assiniboine failed. Their 1,200 lodges were reduced to some 400, less than 3,000 people surviving. They were only one of many tribes thus diminished. Or perhaps here, a few Santee families gathered around an evening campfire to listen to a grandmother's story 40 years later, a story telling how a white man named Isaac Covey, working at Fort Quappel, found himself without cowpox vaccine when the great smallpox epidemic of 1838 began to spread, and how, remembering the old way of doing it, he went to old Breland, a Métis, whose grandchild had been vaccinated, and begged him for a limb from the child's arm, was granted enough healthy vaccine on windowpane fragments to protect everyone at the fort, the people becoming the next source, supplying sufficient vaccines to protect all people about surrounding lakes, and visiting Indians at the fort who became the third source, journeying to the southern plain and remote places like Touchwood Hills and Wood Mountain. These people doing their work so well that not a single case of smallpox occurred among them. The northern place was another story, and maybe the Santee grandmother knew the story of the Christ child and was able to give it meaning, still another meaning, making it live. So this is the poem. Now we move on to an analysis of the poem. Now at the very outset, you may notice that Suknaski talks about the meadowlark song, the waters, flowing lazily, the wood mountain, the moss springs. So it is all about the natural elements, is it not? And then you have a description from the natural elements, you have a history of the settlers, and also a description about the 3 rings of stone. Now, what are these 3 rings of stones? They are the teepee rings. Teepee rings are rings that the native tribes used when they would, when they would encamp, when they would identify certain areas for camping, and then they would use these rings to anchor their tents. And these tents would be made of, barks or some other natural material, and that is how they would make their settlements. So the teepee rings there represents the Native American way of life. So here we have the poet talking about the natural elements of his land, and then the teepee rings, and then you have a description of Lee Sopalo, Lee Sopalo's father to be, particularly, he talks about Lee Sopalo's father, who is representative of the settler experience. So here you have a writer who begins by talking about the natural elements of his place. Then he moves on to a description of the teepee rings, which represent the Native American culture and way of life. Then followed by a discussion of a representation of Lee Sopalo's father, who stands for the settler community. So you have all about the landscape in that one stanza. So here you have the writer who claims his right to write about the place of his birth. So he's writing particularly about this place called Wood Mountain, and that is how he chooses to begin the poem, by describing about the natural beauty of Wood Mountain. And then you have a description of the creek running, and you also are told about how he would enjoy fishing in this particular creek, and how he was unaware as a boy. As a young boy, he was unaware that there were these 3 rings of stone which had nearly vanished beneath this dust from a field that Lee Sopalo's father was assiduously working on this particular field. So you have the pastoral way of life, and you have the native Indian rings which are lying buried now. So the native Indian rings are buried under the dust from the field Lee Sopalo's father was working on, trying to feed his family in the 30s. Now the 1930s that the poet mentions here was the period of Great Depression, and this is also known as the dirty 30s in Canada, because you have this huge drought and grasshopper hail that destroyed the wheat production in the Canadian prairies. And many families evacuated Saskatchewan because they just couldn't leave. You had this huge pile of dust settling everywhere, over their fields, over their houses. So it was very difficult for people to survive in Saskatchewan, and there was mass migration, there was mass migration, and people were going to different parts of Canada. And this is what the dirty 30s was all about, and this is what the Dust Bowl was all about. So here you have a settler, Lee Sopalo's father, who has not left Saskatchewan but is trying his best to provide for his family, trying to plow this field, in the period of drought. So you have a representation of the settler experience as well. And then he talks about how the 3 rings of stone, as I said, they are part of a memory. They are part of a memory, you call that a palimpsest. So you have the stones beneath this field that Lee Sopalo's father is working on. So you have one memory, another memory being overwritten on a particular memory. So it is what a palimpsest is all about. So this memory is palimpsestic, a memory that is continually being written over. So not just geographically, but in the mindscape as well, you have one memory being written over another memory. In this case, the Native American traditional memory, which is represented by the 3 tipi rings, and over that you have a pile of dust from the field that Lee Sopalo's father is plowing. So you have one memory on top of the other. So you have the settler experience, the Dust Bowl, the 1930s, and the Dust Bowl years, in fact, they live on in the imagination and landscapes of Western Canadians. So it was a traumatic experience for many of the settler families there. So this continues to be a part of their imagination. Writers even today talk about the Dust Bowl years. Now, then the writer talks about how, a wired stone anchors. His heart is held like a wired stone that anchors the tipis. So it is a powerful evocation of his connection with the place of his birth. So it is like a stone, a wired stone is anchoring him there to the place of his birth. And he claims the right to write about this place. So as I said earlier, he is a poet of place. Now he asserts his right to memory and memorialization, the right to comprehend and chronicle the history of the land and its people. Now he talks about a geography of blood. Now because the history of his people is marked by death, it is marked by decay, it is marked by disease. That is why it is a geography of blood. He wants to describe this geography, this space. He claims the space and place moving beyond time. He says, I want to go beyond time, across time. He wants to talk about his place, and he says the four cardinal directions are guiding him. Now, the reference to the 4 cardinal directions, it's part of native tradition, because before anything auspicious, the native tribes, they pray to all the 4 directions. So it is part of their ritual. So here he says the 4 cardinal directions are guiding him in his attempt to claim the right to speak about his place, to claim his right to speak about a place that he loves. And however, the writer himself is very conscious of his inability to truly decipher the landscape and its effects on him. So as I said earlier, he does not belong to the native tribe, the First Nations. He does not belong to any tribe in particular. He has more or less of a settler experience, and that is why maybe he's conscious of his inability to fully comprehend and chronicle the history of the tribes. That is why he says, I have failed, failure to making them live. That is what the poet says. He says he is conscious that he may fail in his attempt to find meaning of what is happening around him, what he sees around him. He may not be able to comprehend the past fully. So he admits that. That is what he says, failure to make them live. That is what those lines mean. And basically, so we are introduced in the first stanza to his place. We are told about the beauty of the place, about growing up in that particular place. We are told about the settler experience there. We are also told about the First Nations tradition there in the form of the 3 rings. Now, First Nations is the term that we usually use to describe the native tribes of Canada. The major tribe, other than the major tribes, the rest of the tribes are addressed as First Nations. The Métis would be one of the major tribes of Canada, and when we say Native Americans, it's usually for native tribes in America, and First Nations is the term that we generally use to describe about the tribes in Canada. So that is the first stanza description of that. Moving on to the second part of the poem. It is divided into 2 parts. So we have described the first part, and now we move on to the second part. Now, second part, it begins with a description of one particular man, Vessel Tonita. Vessel Tonita, 70 now. Now, Vessel Tonita is an actual citizen of Wood Mountain. So he is an actual citizen of Wood Mountain in time and space. Now, here Suknaski has brought in, real people in his poem. When he describes about Wood Mountain, when he describes about his people, we have to understand that these are all people who actually lived there. Now, Lee Sopalo happens to be Vessel Tonita's son-in-law. Now, Lee Sopalo was married to Mary, who is the daughter of Vessel Tonita. So they are all people who actually lived in this particular place. So Vessel Tonita, he represents the prairie way of life. So we have him riding the spirited stallion, and then you have the next line which says his sons cannot do that. So there we have the sons moving away from the prairie way of life. So time and place have changed for his sons as they move away from the pastoral way of life. So you have a daily occurrence for Vessel Tonita. His typical day. He's riding a stallion. He's looking for a missing cow which is missing somewhere down the river, and so there is a description of the prairie way of life there. And the poet, he next talks about a hawk. Now, hawk symbolism is very important as far as native writing is concerned, because a hawk represents power, it represents courage and strength. Hawks are guardians as well as messengers from the ancestors. Now, seeing or dreaming a hawk, about a hawk, can be seen as a warning of danger. Now, here the poet sees a hawk that is circling about, and the poet is trying hard. He is alert to the possibility of hearing the voices of his ancestors. Now, he says, I'm trying to listen to the voice of the ancestors. And he says, I can sometimes hear them in the rustle of the leaves by the creek. Now, there is an attempt to connect to the past, and right from dream time onwards. Now, dream time refers to the creation, the creation of a particular type, the time, that is how you usually refer to the origins, the dream time. So you have from dream time onwards, he's trying to understand his ancestors. Now, he's trying to imagine who were his ancestors, what was their way of life, right from the creation myth onwards. Now, the reference to how the prairie could become a brown sea. Now, a prairie, the landscape of the prairie is unique. You have these vast swaths of land which almost look like a sea, and you can, it is as if you can see the waves. When the wind blows, you can see the grass, undulating movement of the grass, which is almost like the sea. Now, the sea reference there could also be to the creation myth of the native tribes, because most of the tribes, most of them have a flood as the beginning of the creation. It is from the floods that the tribe, the landscape is created, and then the people, and the landscape is peopled by the inhabitants. So it all starts from a flood. So maybe it is a reference to the creation myth also. So he talks about the dream time, the creation myth, the origins, and also how the native Indian lived in these lands. How the hunter-gatherer experience of providing for the family, and how his songs would later become prayers, become part of rituals. So how the songs gave rise to rituals, to ceremonies. So it's basically about the native Indian or the tribe's way of living, just being themselves, what they did in those prairies. So he's trying to imagine that. He's trying to connect to the past of the creation myth, and how the Indians inhabited the prairies, and how they would carry on with their day-to-day lives. And he says this time has now passed. Today, you cannot find many tribes carrying on with their, ritualistic activities anymore. The time has passed. The traces of the past are very few and far between. Now, there are very few people who are curious of unearthing this past. Not many of them have interest in the past. Now, you have one person here who actually tries to discover something of the past, and that is Lee Sopalo. Now, Lee Sopalo, he tries to recreate this ancestral space. Now, he discovers on his field, he tries to, he very painstakingly, he discovers where all the 3 rings where the teepee stood. So he discovers that, and though it is a back-breaking exercise for him, he takes the trouble to actually, use a wired anchor, and he tries to find out these places. Now, he recreates the space, or he discovers the space. Now, what Lee Sopalo does here is that he puts the poet's ideological motivations into practice. Now, the poet, remember, uses the term wired anchor to describe his strong connection with the past, while you have Lee Sopalo actually using the wired anchor to discover a relic of the past. So the poet writes a poem about the Indian site that Lee Sopalo actually discovers. So that is the 2 wired anchors that we find, the connection between the 2 wired anchors in the poem. Moving on, he then asks a very relevant question. Who were these ancestors? Who were the people who lived on the prairies? And he says he doesn't know for sure. Only the wind knows the real answer. No, they could have been the Gros Ventre, that is the white clay tribe, or the Ashki, another tribe, or it could have been some of the others who went along with the Assiniboine tribesmen who would go on trades. So here we have a reference to the fur trade that was carried on between the natives and the Westerners. Now, here you have a particular incident being mentioned. You have a factory known as the Hudson's Bay Company Trading Post, and they had a factory at this place called York. And this is a reference to an incident that took place in 1716. And there was increasing trade between the Westerners and the natives, and the natives started increasingly depending on goods from England and other countries, and they started depending heavily on such goods, and there was starvation and death when the provisions failed to arrive from England. So that is the reference there of that particular summer of 1716, when the English ships carrying provisions did not arrive early on. So many of them died of hunger. So it could have been those tribesmen, or it could have been the Assiniboine themselves. It could have been that particular tribe. They were traders. They used to trade on the Missouri, and because of that, they were frequently in contact with the white man. And what happened was that there was a smallpox outbreak, and this was what the white men actually gave the Assiniboine tribe. It is from the white men that the tribe got exposed to this particular disease, and which was unknown to them, and they were not vaccinated. So then you have a reference to the second smallpox outbreak at Fort Union in 1837. So this was an event where unvaccinated tribes, particularly the Assiniboine, perished during the pandemic. And these people, they thought that if they would move northward to the northern territories, they could escape the disease. But unfortunately, that did not happen, and the tribes, they were decapacitated. And they tried to flee the disease that the white men gave them, but in vain. And their population dwindled to less than 3,000 because of smallpox and epidemic-related starvation. Assiniboine were only one of the tribes that perished. So we can imagine the significance. And smallpox, it was very significant because it changed power structures, alliances, as well as land use and occupancy. So it is very important in the history of the native tribe. It is a very important period in the history of the native population. The history of the tribes is also a history of hunger. It is also a history of disease. It is a history of death. It is a history of decay. So this is what the poet wants to emphasize with reference to those people who died of starvation because the provisions did not reach early on, and he also talks about the second smallpox epidemic. Now this is after the first smallpox epidemic, which was from 1779 to 1783, and it is said that among the plains indigenous people, 75% of them died. So moving on to the last stanza, he says, maybe it was the Santees who lived here. So again, Santee is another tribe, a tribe that is from South Carolina, and here the Santees again have gathered around to listen to a story of a which a Santee grandmother is narrating 40 years later. So it is 40 years after the second epidemic outbreak, and everybody is listening to the story about a white man. Now his name was Isaac Covey, and he was a fur trader and a politician who worked at another trading post, Fort Qu'Appelle. And Covey, he finds himself severely short of vaccinations during the second epidemic. So what does he do? He decides to seek help from the Métis, another tribe. So he goes to a Métis elder, and this tribe has been vaccinated, and he goes there and he requests the elder that he may extract vaccinia like how the older people would do. You remember the story of how this smallpox vaccine was actually discovered. So he requests the elder to provide vaccinia from a vaccinated child. He extracts that from a small child who has been vaccinated. From the lymph of the child, he extracts the vaccinia, and this extraction is used to create, prepare vaccinations, and there are enough and more vaccinations which Covey manages to produce, and he successfully protects everyone at the post. So the Métis here become the first source for the vaccine, in contrast to the whites, who were the source of the disease. Now the vaccinated people at the trading post and surrounding areas become the second source. The visiting tribes become the third source, and these tribes, the visiting tribes, they carry it to the southern plains, including to places like Wood Mountain. And the poet talks about how the tribes effectively managed to contain the epidemic, and not a single case of smallpox was reported. Now, however, he understands that the northern tribes weren't so lucky, and they completely perished because of smallpox. So what the poet is trying to say is that the experiences of the tribes are not homogeneous. There is not a single story of the tribes. Now, the Santee grandmother perhaps also knew of Christ. So this is a reference to the arrival of organized religion. Now, at the time of when the Santee grandmother is probably narrating this, that is the 1870s, you have actually the Santee tribe splitting into two because of Christianity. There is one group which adheres to the native rituals and traditions, and there is another group which expounds the values of Christianity. Now there is a reference to Christianity and organized religion, and the poet hopes that the Santee grandmother could perhaps give meaning to her story and pass it on to her listeners, making it live. Now, this is in contrast to the poet's own inability to meaningfully chronicle the story of his place. Now, to conclude, the poem gives a lot of importance to place. Now, what is place? Place is what gives space meaning, personality, and a connection to a cultural and personal identity. So, you have the place and you have the space. Place gives personality to space. Now, this poem, Indian Sight on the Edge of Tonita Pasture, is a poem that celebrates, remembers, and reveres this place. A poem that very beautifully yokes the First Nations and settler experiences together. Thank you.